Good evening, and welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's program with Sarah Gold McBride on her recent book, Whiskerology, The Culture of Hair in 19th-Century America. We are coming to you from the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc community, who remain an active and vibrant presence here in central Massachusetts. My name is Nan Wolverton, Vice President for Academic and Public Programs here at the Society. As a National Research Library, our mission is to cultivate a deeper understanding of the American past, grounded in the primary sources that we house here at the Society. We foster a broad community of inquiry through inclusive programs and support of scholarship. We welcome researchers from around the world and from right here in Worcester to use our collections, both physical and digital, and we host programs like this one tonight, which helps provide insights into the past and its resonance for today. Many of our programs feature scholars who have conducted research using our collections, and that is the case this evening, and I'll say more about our speaker in a moment. This program is being recorded, and you can watch recordings of all of our programs on our YouTube channel, or you can go to our website at americanantiquarian.org, go to the Programs and Events tab, and you can find recordings of all of our past programs. We will have time for your questions later on in the program, and you can post them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen at any time during the program. My colleague, Lauren Havelis, Program and Events Coordinator, will be putting relevant information into the chat during the program. And please know that as a private nonprofit organization, we welcome any support that you can provide to help keep our work going, and we thank you for that. And it is now my pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening. Sarah Gold McBride is a lecturer in the program in American Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, where she has been on the faculty since 2019. A graduate of UC Berkeley's Department of History, she has received several awards from the university in recognition of her teaching and mentorship, including the Faculty Award for Outstanding Mentorship of Graduate Student Instructors and the American Culture's Excellence in Teaching Award. A historian of the 19th century United States, Gold McBride's research and teaching focus on the daily lives of ordinary Americans, the books and newspapers they read, the art and science they created, the plays and freak shows they attended, the museums and world fairs they visited, and the information they found meaningful as they tried to understand race, gender, and national identity. Sarah attended in 2014 a summer seminar here on the art and science of technology. It was hosted by the Center for Historic American Visual Culture, or what we refer to as CHAVIC. The seminar participants for this summer's CHAVIC seminar are here at AAS this week, focusing on the topic of 19th century American photography in the world. So we are thrilled to welcome Sarah back to AAS virtually this week when the seminar that first brought her here is currently underway. And we're delighted that many of those seminar participants are joining us this evening. Sarah will be presenting on her book that just came out last month from Harvard University Press, Whiskerology, The Culture of Hair in 19th Century America. And it was just recently reviewed in the New Yorker, so congratulations on that. Sarah, over to you.
Right. Hi, Nan. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction and welcome to everyone who is here. Let me just get my slides up and going here. All right, there we go. Great. Okay. I'm so grateful to Nan and to Lauren for hosting this talk tonight. It really feels so special, as Nan suggested, to be giving this talk here with you all virtually, virtually here at the American Antiquarian Society. My book came out almost exactly 2 months ago, and I've been really fortunate to have the opportunity to, over the last few months, to speak about this book in a number of different settings and for different groups of people. But it really does feel fitting and quite exciting to be here with you tonight to talk about the book here, because the American Antiquarian Society was one of the very first archives I visited when I was researching the dissertation that turned into this book. As Nan mentioned, I first came to the Society for a Chavik seminar and was able, during that visit, to see and read some of the Society's incredible sources for the first time. During that seminar, the archivists pulled for me some very cool objects like the Harry Valentine's collection and some of letters that included locks of hair. And I, in turn, took the truly terrible, blurry photos of what I saw, some of which I'm showing you here, pulled from the vintage archives of my Google Photos. But this visit to Chavik in 2014 and then another longer research visit the following summer helped make real a project that at the time was still formulating in my mind. A project I had written a prospectus for as a graduate student and was working on as a dissertation, but one that was still a little bit nebulous. And if this was a project that intended to take seriously the story of hair in 19th century America. It was a story that included, of course, these very kinds of hair objects, three of which you're seeing here on the screen. The kinds of hair objects we already knew were a peculiar part of 19th century American culture. Indeed, if historians and other scholars of the past knew anything about hair in 19th century America, it was probably these objects that they probably knew, and many of you probably know, that over 100 years ago, people in the United States used human hair as a medium for mourning, for memory, and for creative production. That strands of hair were turned into elaborate designs that became bracelets, brooches, necklaces, artwork, Valentine's, baby book inclusions, a lock slipped into a letter or placed between the pages of a diary, and so on. And indeed, the Society's collection includes both instruction manuals for making objects like these, either as a professional hair worker or at home, and objects made using those very instructions. So this was the part of 19th century American hair history that we knew, these objects. And this is an important history. But I had a sense that telling the story of hair objects in isolation from the hair as it grew from the body, that doing so wasn't telling the whole story of American hair in the nation's first century. And so that's the story I tried to tell with this book, one that brings together objects like these you see here with other kinds of everyday, ordinary stories of hair still attached to the body from which it grew. And that's the story that I've tried to tell with this book. So over a decade later, after I first began, all of this research amounted to this book released earlier this year. I want to tell you first a bit about the argument I make in this book, how I'm trying to intervene in the way we understand not just hair in 19th century America, but also how we understand the body itself and what the body meant, and even the boundaries of the body itself from a 19th century perspective. I'll talk a little bit after that about some of the methods that I drew on to compose this book. And then I want to talk to you a little bit about one of its chapters, a chapter in which the materials from the Society were especially important. Of course, for the sake of time, I want to leave plenty of time for questions. I won't talk about every single chapter, but I welcome your questions at the end about all elements of American hair. But let's begin. I want to tell you a bit about the big picture, the central arguments of this book, so that we can situate how the chapter I'll focus on relates to this bigger argument. So in Whiskerology, I argue that people living across the United States during the 19th century, people from different regions, different religious traditions, different racial and ethnic identities, different age groups, different genders, all different kinds of people, shared in common the belief that hair had the power to reveal the truth about the person from whose body it grew. Hair was broadly understood to be capable of quickly and reliably conveying important information about a person's core identity, especially qualities like their gender and their race, but also elements of their personality. For example, whether a person was ambitious or courageous or likely to commit a crime. Moreover, one of the most exciting findings of my research was that in some specific contexts, including one I'll tell you about today, hair was thought to be even more reliable than other body parts that we more often think of as relevant to the way Americans have tried to read identity from the body. And this is especially relevant when we talk about reading race in the body, that hair is certainly a racialized feature. And there has been ample scholarship, especially by Black feminist scholars, about hair and race. But when it comes to the way we think about the body's role in sort of categorizing or classifying or taxonomizing racial identity in the 19th century, in a century, of course, when racial identity felt more fraught than ever before in American life. To classify a person, the kinds of bodily evidence that we usually think about and talk about are things like skin color or the shape of the skull. But what I found in my research is that it wasn't simply that hair was another example of a bodily feature that could have racial meaning. In some settings, hair was thought to be the most reliable piece of evidence of all, more reliable than any other part of the body. And indeed, I'm saying part of the body on purpose here, because the other big claim I'm making in this book is that from a 19th century perspective, hair truly was a part of the body. Hair was a body part, it was an appendage. And it's important that we mark this in time and place because many of us know that historically the profession of a barber and the profession of a surgeon were the same, that the same person in charge of tending to the hair was also in charge of cutting the body. But this confluence of these two now separate professions, these jobs had long separated by the time we get to 19th century America. So we can't simply explain the treatment of the hair as an appendage as a kind of residue or relic of this barber surgeon profession. What I found in my research is that a 19th century American's typical perspective about hair was that it was within the boundaries of the body. It was as much a body part as any of the flesh and bone parts that we today think of as part of the body. And I think the fact that we now understand the boundaries of the body differently than people did in the past, in the 19th century in particular, this has really been the reason that so much of the significance of hair to 19th century understandings of the body, and in turn, how the body played a role in understanding identity. I think scholars have really overlooked this because we don't share that same conception of hair today. Hair obviously matters, of course. I'm sure every single one of us here in this webinar can think of examples in our own lives, in our communities, in our families, in our pasts, where hair mattered, where hair carried meaning. Hair was important to us or people we love. But hair today isn't thought of as part of the body. Hair grows from the body, but isn't really of it in the same kind of way. That doesn't mean it's any less significant to us today, but it does mean, I argue, that the way that significance operates is quite different. And it's not simply the case that people used to see hair as a body part and now that meaning has faded. What I found in my research is that this really is a quite specifically 19th century way of understanding hair. That in the period prior to the 19th century, in English North America, in the colonial period, hair was important for its styling, that the way a person styled their hair could communicate important messages to their community about, for example, their religious faith. As an English man, for example, in North America, to keep one's hair short was a way of communicating that one was a true Christian, observant Christian. And we see the way that short haircuts for men was also an important part of conversion stories for Indigenous people on North America's eastern seaboard, where many conversion narratives of Indigenous men who underwent conversion describe a haircut, a short haircut, as part of that process. So certainly hairstyling was important and it communicated messages, especially about religious identity. But the other way that hair was, but in this way, I think we can see that hair acts like clothing or like another type of accessory. That to style one's hair in a particular way, to communicate, say, I'm an observant Puritan, is an example of hair being treated and regulated and observed as similar to clothing or accessories. Not, in other words, part of the body. So hair was, in this way, squarely outside the body's boundaries. And moreover, science and medicine is a big part of my story in this book, as I'll talk about more in a few minutes. And under a humoral understanding of the human body, hair was likely to be seen as a type of basically excrement, a form of bodily waste, just like urine or semen or breast milk or blood. Hair was a type of excrement, something that exited the body and was not a body part in the same way it would become in the 19th century. So hair was in the 19th century understood to be a part of the body, and it was accorded this grave significance for communicating something important and reliable and readable, legible by the person's external community. And this is part of what makes my 19th century story so different from the way we experience hair today, is that 19th century Americans were really very interested in how hair could allow them to interpret the body of a person they had just met. That when they met a stranger, they could learn something meaningful, almost immediately, meaningful, reliable, and immediately about a person they didn't know. And the reason that hair becomes so freighted with significance and so significant indeed in the 19th century is a product of the broader context of this time and place, the broader economic, political, and social changes that completely shifted the United States between roughly 1800 and 1900. I think many of us probably here in this webinar, myself included, are folks who study or teach the history of the early United States. And even for us who are really, swimming in this history all the time, I think it's hard or it's worth reminding ourselves just how profoundly changed virtually every single facet of the US was over that 100-year period. It's almost like a greatest hits of structural changes from abolition to capitalism and urbanization to immigration and immigration restriction, expanded national transportation and communication networks, mass media, mass voting rights for white men, colonization, and by the end of the century, imperialism, expanded white supremacist violence against Black and Indigenous people, new understandings of science and medicine. It's like I could teach a whole class on just these shifts alone. But this is the backdrop against which the meaning of hair changed. And that's what I argue in the book is that what these dizzying list of changes all share in common is they not only scrambled the kinds of institutions that had long provided ways of understanding difference between human cultures and bodies on a more ordinary, kind of everyday level. They just forced Americans to deal with strangers in a way they had never had to do before. And this is another one of those elements of 19th century life that I think is really worth sitting with for a moment. When I teach 19th century history to my students, this is one of those lessons I really make us sit with for quite a few minutes, for a full lecture even, because it's so normalized for us today to interact with strangers constantly. And for us, even strangers, true strangers, in that we on through the internet, people we will never see, whose names we don't even know. But even just in our in real life lives, our IRL lives, interacting with strangers is such a typical and normalized part of our lives. But this is radically new for 19th century Americans. It's hard to even to imagine, to put ourselves in the shoes of people who just a few generations earlier would almost always be talking to people and interacting with and doing business with people they knew. And then within just about 2 generations, there are just strangers everywhere. Strangers buying goods from your shop or trying to sell you something, whether it's a legitimate product or some kind of magic cure-all remedy, many of which had to do with hair, in fact. Strangers coming through your town on the train, strangers sitting next to you on the train or in a lecture hall or walking next to you at a World's Fair or circus, strangers asking if they could borrow your watch. That's the most infamous urban criminal, the confidence man. His trick relied entirely on people's unease about or sort of shifting relationship with trusting a stranger whom you meet in a city. His trick was to encounter a stranger other in a city, pretend like they knew each other and really rely on their mark feeling embarrassed that they didn't remember this old friend or former colleague or whatnot, and then have a nice conversation in the street or in the train or wherever. And then the confidence man asks to borrow your watch for the day. Surely he'll return it the next day. And of course, you never see your watch again. So the fact that the confidence man is really the specter of the 19th century American city demonstrates the way that trust or mistrust or um, anxiety about being able to identify a stranger immediately and know whether that's someone you can trust, that this is part of this bigger context of the shifting landscape of American life during this century. And it's even more so fraught because of how so many of these strangers were people who did not look the same or work in the same kinds of ways or speak the same languages or have the same kind of familial or cultural practices as people had been experiencing in their communities for previous generations. So living in a world of strangers, which is what the 19th century increasingly felt like for so many Americans, makes it so that is a really like totally rocks life of the 19th century, is what I'm trying to say. Now, of course, there are some ways that being in a big crowd of strangers can be thrilling, even liberating. There's stories of all kinds of people who left their small rural communities or their small towns or their families, moved to a big city for a new kind of life. But lots of people were also really, really nervous about these changes because how could you know who to trust when you hardly knew anyone around you and everyone around you could be lying to you or trying to scam you or trick you in some kind of way? And this is especially true for upper and middle class white men and women, especially those who lived in the Northeast, because they were the very same people who are most likely to be interacting with strangers and have significant social and financial stakes in being deceived. They're the people who are most likely to live in a city, to work and consume through the market economy, or to attend a large cultural or commercial event. And this shift in context and the nervousness that it created was exactly why so many 19th century Americans, especially those well-to-do white Americans, were interested in coming up with new ways to evaluate unfamiliar people quickly and reliably. This is how we get, for example, early experience with a credit rating system that could help discern whether a potential business partner was reliable. But no matter the form of discernment of a stranger's identity, no method or type of evidence was as compelling in the 19th century as the human body itself. In all different kinds of publications, from medical journal articles to popular newspapers to etiquette and advice guides, 19th century cultural and scientific authorities tried to identify, to measure, and to classify parts of the body that they argued were impossible to fake. Even the best confidence man's performance, they believed, could not obscure the truth that was evident in his body. Some of the sciences, though we'd now call them pseudosciences, that come out of this search for body classification are probably familiar to you already, especially phrenology, which was the notion that the shape of the skull reflected the shape of the brain, which in turn reflected the strength or weakness of different elements of a person's personality. That by touching the skull, that one could read who they really were on the inside. And I got to see some really cool phrenology materials at AAS when I was researching there many years ago. But phrenology, fairly well known, fairly well documented. But what wasn't as really known before this book, what I sort of found through the writing of this book, was that hair was also studied and trusted in the same way as flesh and bone parts like the skull. Hair, 19th century people believed, could reveal the truth about who a person really was, regardless of how that person wanted to be perceived and regardless of any tricks they were trying to pull. Now, hair is also different than other flesh and bone parts because it is so malleable. That is the fundamental sort of tension in hair as a platform or a medium rather for reliable, classifiable information, that it is fundamentally malleable, that it can be changed just like that. And that is also what makes it very different from the skull. That some recent research that I think Rachel Walker is the name of the historian who wrote a great book about phrenology and physiognomy, which is the similar pseudoscience of facial features. who explained that phrenology in particular left open the possibility that the skull shape could change. And this was particularly appealing to Black phrenologists who thought that with extensive and intensive education over a long period of time, it was possible that the shape of the brain would change to reflect that education gained. And if the shape of the brain changed, then the shape of the skull could change, and then perhaps a changed person could be perceived by touching the head. And so that left open the possibility that such a flesh and bone part as the skull could even be changeable. But certainly, to change the shape of one's skull was not a certainty. It left open the pathway to doing so was unclear. And even if it was possible, it would take a really long period of time to do so. In contrast, hair can be changed just like that, and many hair changes can be reversed just as quickly. So hair offered this different kind of medium for both trying to classify a person's true personhood, true identity, that their biological self inside their body would come out and be represented externally through their hair. But at the same time, of course, that fundamental malleability, not to mention the growing availability of the kinds of tools needed to change one's hair, thanks to the growing consumer economy, things like hair dye and hair tools, etc. Um, that malleability also meant that hairs could be changed in a way to subvert some of the police powers and hierarchies and institutional regulations of the 19th century. It's a reason why, for example, I read stories of escaped people escaping enslavement who changed their hair in order to pass as white, for example, or as indigenous as part of their escape, or other forms of hair change that could facilitate a subversion of race or gender, gender passing, or passing across race, all different kinds of play and deception that the hair makes possible. And that's what makes hair such, I think, a rich mode for investigation as well, because for all the ways that hair was entrusted to reliably communicate who the person truly was, it could at the same time be changed. And so 19th century Americans try to kind of grapple with these two poles of function, the reliability on one hand and that malleability on the other. This is also the fact that hair was entrusted to be telling the truth about who a person really was is really what makes this 19th century hair story so different from the way hair functions in our contemporary American culture and since the 20th century. That although hair and social identity are still very much connected, our understanding of hairstyling today really emphasizes instead not truth telling of who the biological person inside really is, but instead emphasizes agency and self-discovery. Hair is a medium of self-expression that allows people to convey their own sense of their identity to the public however they please. Whether that person is a hippie in the 1960s and 70s trying to, wear their hair long to communicate, especially men, to communicate that they're part of the counterculture, or it's a teenager who wants to be a punk rocker and gels their hair into a mohawk. Even today, we have examples of on the Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, the white women of that show wearing these similar kind of loose wave hairstyles, often augmented with extensions. So we still know all the ways that hair can be a medium for self-expression. But in the 19th century, by contrast, most Americans believed that hair operated in almost the exact opposite directionality, that the body itself revealed its intrinsic, authentic truth through the hair. That the hair, in other words, was a tell. It would tell on the person from whose body it grew, even if that person was trying to falsify their identity in some kind of way. So by taking these assumptions and beliefs about hair's relationship to the body seriously, Whiskerology reveals how 19th century Americans came to understand their hair as a body part capable of indexing some of the most crucial and consequential parts of identity in 19th century America: race, gender, and national belonging. I want to talk just briefly about the way that I went about researching this book, because one of the challenges of writing a book about hair, and especially hair in ordinary life, not hair as it was tended to in hair salons, not hair as it was tended to in barbershops, not hair as it was turned into consumer products, but truly the everyday experience of having hair, tending to hair, and seeing other people's hair. One of the challenges of doing that is archivally, is in terms of archives. And that's because there is no central hair archive. There is no single place that I could have gone to spend a year of research during graduate school or afterwards to do all of the research that I needed to do for this project. And of course, there's so many historical research projects that don't operate under that fashion, that older model of archival research where you go to one place and you read all of the things and then you write the book. But I truly could not have written this book 30 years ago because of the way that digitized archives were so important for writing this book. I kind of had to create my own hair archive, stitching together materials from so many different digitized source bases, in addition to materials I've read and touched and saw in archives. I visited, for example, my own campus's Bancroft Library, which is our special collections at UC Berkeley, the special collections at UC Los Angeles, Drexel University's Academy of Natural Sciences archive, which I'll talk about more in the remaining time today, and of course, AAS. I want to show you a couple of the sources I saw at AAS, some of which were really fundamental in helping me create the groundwork for this project that was otherwise pulling so much on digitized materials. Materials, in other words, that could be searched for with keywords. That's what made it so consequential, is because in order to find newspaper articles about hair or find a letter in which someone talked about their hair, it was so much. I was able to do so with keyword searchability, and that meant that I was able, in this book, for example, I refer to over 160 different newspapers and magazines from all regions of the United States, and that was only possible. I mean, this book took me from start to finish about 14 years from the very first research paper I wrote until publication. If I were to have scoured all the letters in all the newspapers, it would have taken twice as long. So, thanks to digitized archives, optical character recognition, and keyword searchability, I was able to bring together so many different kinds of sources to complement things I found in archives like AAS. So, at AAS, I saw sources like these objects made from or with hair that I showed you earlier, especially the Valentines, hair sent through letters, and other kinds of physical objects made from hair. I also looked at sources like these, texts and images that showcase how hair was central to popular entertainment in the 19th century. I'm showing you here three sources from the Society's collections, all of which relate to freak shows and other forms of the display of unusual bodies. Many of the most popular performers or performance archetypes or characters relied on unusual hair. So here we have, for example, on the left, a memoir or a biography, rather, of a famous bearded lady, the first bearded lady to perform in the United States. There's actually a photo. One of the images from the leftmost text is in my book. And then at the center and at the right, we see discussion of people with albinism. This advertising pamphlet or advertising circular in the front. In the middle of the slide, we see an advertisement for Barnum's American Museum in New York City. One display of which was called The Albino Family, and we see a photograph on the right of one such albino performer called Unzi. Now, the third type of source that I read a lot of at AAS, and this was unlike anything I could access elsewhere, were texts about the science of hair. That AAS has a unmatched collection of early American periodicals, pamphlets, and other kinds of ephemera publications that aren't collected en masse anywhere else that I know of in the United States. And so what I was able to read is a huge array of writing by famous people, by ordinary people, by random people about the science of hair. And that is where I want to turn to now. And that's because the book is structured around four debates within hair discourse, where hair's relationship to gender, race, and national identity were especially fraught. The first chapter focuses on long hair versus short hair. The second chapter focuses on facial hair. The third chapter surveys the scientific study of hair, and the fourth chapter explores hair's ability to facilitate a fraudulent disguise. That one's called hair fraud. Now, in structuring the book this way, I make no claim to comprehensiveness. Indeed, the ubiquity of hair in human life and on human bodies would make that truly impossible to do. Instead, what I tried to do by structuring the book this way is to demonstrate the significance of hair and its function as a social signifier in many places and for many people. In so doing, Whiskerology suggests that this cultural narrative of hair and the ability of hair to be read by strangers and to convey meaningful information, that this was pervasive and widespread, that it spanned social groups and discursive contexts, and that it was meaningful in all different kinds of places, really. And so, with my remaining time today, just the next about 5 minutes, I want to tell you a little bit about one of these chapters, and that's the third chapter on the science of hair, because so much of the foundation of this chapter comes from research I did at the American Antiquarian Society. As Nan mentioned, the first time I came to AAS was for the Chavik Summer Seminar in 2014, focused on the art of science and technology, which makes this really a fitting kind of full circle moment for this talk. Because of the Society's enormous collection of early American print culture, I was able to understand how, in the 19th century's second quarter in particular, that's roughly 1820 to about 1850, American scientists began to claim for themselves a privileged expertise about the meanings embedded in hair. By this period, hair's ability to reveal the intrinsic truth about a person from whose body it grew had been quite well established in American culture. But in the 1840s and 50s, these assessments of hair's meaning also began to bear the weight of scientific authority. And this was quite new. Before the 19th century, hair itself was rarely the subject of in-depth or sustained medical or scientific inquiry. There is a shift in roughly the 1830s, a modest boom in scientific style writing about hair in the United States. Now, I showed you this picture before, but I want to show it to you again because these pamphlets often are short books, short publications. All three of these are from the AAS collection. They have the hilariously repetitive titles. The three you see here are from left to right: Treatise on the Hair, Treatise on the Human Hair, and A Treatise on the Human Hair. So they varied almost as little in their content as they did in their titles. Each of the texts I'm showing you here and the many others that I read describe the physical structure of hair follicles, explore the functions of hair that hair provided for the body, outline differences of hair color, texture, and length, talk about hair diseases and disorders, and surveyed hair practices across different cultures. Now, the backbone of every text was its claim of privileged knowledge, the assertion that an accurate understanding of hair could only come from an evidence-based scientific investigation performed by an expert. But just who counted as an expert? Quite a wide group of folks that are represented here. Authors with a wide range of backgrounds and with a wide range of medical, scientific, or vocational credentials claimed that they had this expertise about hair as they produced scientific style writing about hair. I found by looking at the AAS's collection of writing about the scientific hair pamphlets, as well as others I found elsewhere, often digitized, I found basically two waves of scientific writing about hair. The first group, published from the late 1830s through the 1850s, were overwhelmingly written by hair care professionals. That means hairdressers, barbers, and wig makers. And almost always, these pamphlets were designed to sell a product, a patent medicine for the hair, usually called a specific, that would solve every possible malady that could plague a head of hair. In often cases, it was one specific that could magically cure anything wrong with the hair, whether it's dandruff or baldness or gray hair or some kind of lice or other bug in the hair. So, for example, one of the earliest known scientific hair texts published in the US, this is a text I read at AAS and was dated by archivists to be published between 1838 and 1842. This was written by a Manhattan hairdresser and wig maker named Vere Clearhue. It's called A Treatise on the Anatomy and Physiology of the Skin and Hair, slightly different from the others, but not by much. And this pamphlet was intended specifically to sell a product called trichiferis, which Clearhue called, quote, the only effectual remedy ever discovered to prevent baldness and gray hair, to restore the hair where it has fallen off, and to eradicate scurf and dandruffs, end quote. Scurf is basically the skin flakes for which dandruff is known. An amusing aside about Vere Clearhue's trichiferis is that you can actually still to this day buy a product on Amazon called trichiferis. Here is the photo from one of the Amazon listings. You'll see it's called Barry's trichiferis. And although Clearhue was the first person I found to call his hair specific trichiferis, The name ultimately became popularly associated with his rival, Alexander Berry, who was originally Clear Hugh's assistant hair cutter. He was then fired from Clear Hugh's salon and then began soon thereafter selling his own product with the same name. Clear Hugh was so angry by Barry's betrayal that he took out advertisements in newspapers in New York warning consumers of this counterfeit product. And he even brought a lawsuit against Barry that reached the Supreme Court of New York in 1849. But I'm sure Mr. Clear Hugh would be so devastated to learn that to this day, Trichoceros is almost uniformly called Barry's Trichoceros if you find it on Amazon, for example. Anyway, back to our story. I just find that to be such an amusing aside. So after this first wave of hair publications, published mostly by hair care professionals, we get a second wave in the late 1830s through the that first wave was 1830s to 1850s. After the 1860s, we get a second wave of hair publications, which were written by trained physicians, men and at least one woman I found an example written by, who were increasingly professionalized with the formation of the American Medical Association, the AMA. Some of these authors were indeed legitimate trained physicians who were medical school professors or belonged to the AMA, but there were also some who tried to draft off of doctors' prestige, like Clear Hugh's old nemesis, Alexander Berry, who called himself Professor Berry, despite there being no evidence he had any professional medical training. So regardless of whether they were professionally trained or simply pretenders, this group of authors shared, and across both of these waves, their appeal to the authority and prestige of science in order to establish their own credibility. They did so by using the specialized medical terminology. Many of these texts include these absolutely mind-numbing, long, detailed passages about the precise structure of follicles of hair and strands of hair, like to the degree of detail that makes your eyes go cross. Some authors used specialized medical vocabulary or tools as well to demonstrate their expert knowledge of the human body. The microscope was especially influential here. And in fact, by the 1840s, microscopy had become such a trusted technology for understanding the body that simply using a microscope validated the data it produced. Now, for all of these authors, the centerpiece of their claims of expertise was their unit of analysis, which was a single strand of hair. This is an example from a source I saw at AAS, published in 1841 by a guy called Thomas Bogue. This is one of those a treatise titles. So the strand of hair, these authors argued, was the site of hair's essential biological features, its thickness, its color, its texture, and its strength, which meant, therefore, whether it could go long or not. Hair strands were a reliable scientific material, moreover, because they could be evaluated and measured using a microscope, and importantly, because their dimensions were constant. No form of hair disguise, no razor, no hair dye, no false hairpiece, no wig could change the shape and structure of a single strand of hair. Crucially, moreover, the physical structure of hair strands also became the basis for hair scientists' claim about racial identity. The claim that hair could be the most reliable evidence of a person's race. By mid-century, by the 1850s, in other words, there was increasing recognition that features that might be previously entrusted to, bodily features that were previously entrusted to identify race, such as skin color, were simply not reliable. They were too inconsistent. There was too much variation. And so this brings us to the man who became the 19th century's greatest expert on the science of hair. That's a man named Peter Brown. I don't have any images of Brown himself to show you, so instead I'm going to show you his magnum opus. These are photographs I took at the Academy of Natural Sciences at Drexel in Philadelphia of what Brown called specimens of pile being a synonym for hair. These are, I think it's 12 volumes in particular. You can see a photograph of one here on the left. Each one is filled with these specialized pieces of paper that Brown had printed, and each one contains hair samples from human and non-human mammals. Here, I'm showing you a photograph I took of the bristles of an elephant. As an interesting aside, and we can talk about this more in the Q&A, the 9 volumes of Brown's collection where he stored human hair have been pulled out of circulation because of concerns about the ethics of holding human hair samples, many of which were not obtained with consent, and many of which are from indigenous people and therefore are subject to the regulations of the Native American Grave and Repatriation Act, Grave Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA. So I didn't actually get to see volumes 1 through 9 when I visited Drexel because those were the human hairs samples that had been pulled out of circulation. So I got to see the sheep and the elephants and the ferrets, and the other animals, such as the one you see here. So, Peter Brown became the 19th century's foremost expert on the science of hair, the science of race as seen through hair. His goal in his research on humans was very explicit, to create a three-part taxonomy of hair strand shape, a taxonomy he outlined in this and other publications. This is called The Classification of Mankind, published first in 1850 as a lecture and then again in 1852, in which Brown outlined three strand shapes that he argued could be obtained if you took a strand of hair and then cut it perpendicularly, cut a disc, and then looked at it under a microscope, that it would reveal one of three shapes. You see the three shapes here: perfectly circular, a slight oval, or what he called eccentrically elliptical, or a very oval shape. And Brown argued that racial identity corresponded perfectly, consistently, reliably, and every single time to one of these three shapes. A, on the far left here, this perfect circle, were indigenous people to North America. B, the central shape, were people with European ancestry, white people. And then C, the most eccentrically elliptical, were people of African descent. Now, to posit just three racial categories made Brown a little bit unusual relative to his racial science peers. So he lumped people from Asia, he had a few Chinese hair samples, in with indigenous people in Group A. So Brown's major argument was that hair was a perfectly reliable indicator of race, so much so that this is the frontispiece for his largest publication about the topic, Trichologia Mammalium, in 1853, where he shows the three species of mankind here seen in profile, and he identifies them as their hair strand shape. Figure 61, top left, the cylindrical piled, top right, the oval piled, and bottom, the eccentrically elliptical piled, conflating racial identity and hair strand shape. What he was doing in ultimately, and by the way, if the white head, if it looks familiar, it's the basis for this amazing illustration that the graphic designer at Harvard University Press made for the book. It's the bottom left head comes directly from this frontispiece. So ultimately, Peter Brown was trying to argue, and he was very persuasive to many of his fellow scientists in the 19th century, that hair was the most reliable signal of all of a person's race. I'm going to stop here because I've been a few minutes longer than I was intending. But I wanted to give you a little sneak peek of one of the chapters of this book to see some of the ways I'm thinking about hair. But in the Q&A, I'm more than happy to talk about any type of hair in 19th century America: long hair, short hair, facial hair, hair disguises, whatever other part of early American hair you're interested in discussing. So thank you so much for listening, and I hope we have a lovely conversation with our remaining time.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. You can go ahead and stop sharing your screen, and that way people can see you more easily when you talk.
Great.
Yeah, we have about 15 minutes. We can address some questions. So for those of you who have questions for Sarah, go ahead and put them into the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. I'd like to start with just a simple question, and that is, the term whiskerology in the title of your book. Can you just tell us where that term comes from, when it was coined, and who came up with that?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked, because this has been the title of this book long before it was a book at all. It was the title of my dissertation proposal back in, I think, 2014. And it comes from a primary source. It comes from a New Orleans journalist, Dennis Corcoran, who wrote first in a newspaper article, and then it's republished in a kind of compendium of his writing. He was writing about the then very reliable sciences of phrenology and physiognomy, and how wonderful it was that we can discern so much about a person from the shape of their head or the facial features on their face. And he said, there may even be value in positing a new type of science that is based on the facial hair. And he dubbed this science whiskerology. And although the book is certainly not just about facial hair, it's about hair on the head in all of its forms. I loved this word whiskerology, the reason it so grabbed me from the source. And I should say, I had a wonderful undergraduate research assistant who actually found this source for me when she was working for me one summer, Christina. So so it's so fun to have her, her discovery be on the title of the cover of the book. I love this as the title of the book because it captures the way that the ology part of this word captures the way that scientific expertise was so important to the way that hair was made meaningful and reliable in the 19th century, that it was thought to be this biological part of the body, and that was what gave it so much of its power.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it's a great word, and it's great to have it explained up front.
Yeah.
Um, we do have questions coming in. I want to ask one more, and then we're going to get to some questions from the audience. Um, you know, I you gave us such a good description of what it was in the 19th century that made people interested in hair, and what it was about the 19th century. And you in the book sort of start, as you did tonight a little bit too, like pre-19th century. Can you just say a little bit about, and you've talked a little bit about some of the legacies, but I'm curious about that moment when there's this change in the early 20th century,
Mm-hmm.
um, particularly the failure of the uh, Bureau of Indian Affairs to attempt to use short hair as a way, as a vehicle for uh, indigenous Americanization, like
Yeah.
forced cutting of hair. And I know this is something you talk about a little bit toward the end of the book, but because you talk about long hair, short hair, and maybe this is a story because you have such great stories in this book, that could help to kind of illustrate what that change that came toward the end of the 19th into the early 20th century.
Yeah. So another part of what was so I think fun about this book and what I hope makes it interesting for experts and non-experts alike is that there are a lot of familiar stories in Whiskerology, stories I learned as an undergraduate or graduate student, or people or events or moments, but we see them through a different lens in this book. One such familiar story is the story of the federally run boarding schools for Indigenous children. First, Carlisle was the first of which that became a whole series of these schools. And a familiar part of the story of the federally run boarding school was the compulsory haircut. That is part of this process of forcible Americanization of Indigenous children. School officials would cut children's hair. And that's how we get, I have a couple examples of these really striking and really devastating before and after photos that were produced by school officials to circulate to Congress, to try to get more funding for the boarding schools, to send to donors, and to really showcase the great Americanization work that was happening at places like Carlisle. And a big part of the visual signaling that's happening in these photos is the short haircut for an Indigenous boy who came in with long hair, for example. But I write about, so this is familiar, but what was less familiar to me until I started researching this book was that in 1902, the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs tried to kind of take this compulsory haircut notion and make it not just applicable to kids at boarding school, but also to any Indigenous man on any reservation, and put out a letter that in which he said it became known as the short hair order or the haircut order. And it was the letter said that any this is 1901. I don't remember if I said that. That any man who was living on a reservation should cut his hair short as evidence that he was Americanizing, essentially. That things like wearing an American shirt or shoes, these were not sufficient because they could so easily be taken off. Even forms of dancing or other forms of cultural consumption, they're too easily reversed. And he said a short haircut is fundamental for communicating that they were truly becoming uh, Americanized. So he issues this order to the Indian agents all throughout different reservations throughout the country. He says, "quote You are therefore directed to induce your male Indians to cut their hair." He also talks about painting for men and for women, meaning facial paint on the face and on the skin. No one pays attention to the painting part of this order, but within a very short period of time, both indigenous and white newspapers alike are critiquing this policy and saying it's ludicrous, it's inhumane, it's inappropriate. How dare he try to force anyone to change their hair in a particular way? And the fact that it had pushback by indigenous people was unsurprising to me, but the fact that so many white sources are also saying this is ludicrous, this is absurd. Even members of Congress are interviewed and say, like no one has the right to tell a man how he can wear his hair. And this is the opening story of the book's conclusion because 1901, 1902, as this story is becoming a big part of popular media. And by the way, it was never strenuously enforced. This Jones, who's the commissioner of Indian Affairs, he left the role within a year or two, and the next guy was like, "We are not enforcing this order. Don't worry." It was so wildly unpopular. It shows how the meaning of hair was changing, that hair, self-sovereignty and sort of agency over one's hair was becoming increasingly recognized, not just by Indigenous people, as it had long been, but by European descended people as well. That maybe it wasn't okay to force people to cut their hair in a particular way. Now, there are still institutions, of course, like prisons and the military where compulsory hair styles, certain types of hairstyles, or the prohibition of certain hairstyles were still permitted. But we see the shift in the 20th century where hair basically loses its biological meaning. This is the shift back to hair is not a body part anymore, that hair is not important for early 20th century racial sort of anthropologists and ethnologists who take up the scientific study of race. They're not interested in hair. They recognize that hair has too much internal variation to be meaningful as a form of taxonomy. And so as hair's biological significance fades, so too does its ability to be this kind of truth teller about the person from whose body it grows. And instead, as it is now, it becomes this type of hairstyling that one can use to communicate oneself to the broader public.
Right, right, great. Thank you. Well, we have some really great questions, so I want to get to as many as possible. So we'll keep these short because we really just have 5 minutes. So let me first start with Will, who's wondering if either your facial hair or hair fraud chapters contain anything about possibly transmasculine people, for example, female assigned people adopting, constructing mustache and or other masculine assigned hairstyles. And I know that you can answer this, so we'll keep it short and then we'll get to everybody's questions. So please go ahead.
Yes, the answer is yes. As short as it can be, yes.
Okay, all right. Um, yes, and there are great stories there. I will just say there are many great stories on just that topic.
I won't tell the
Two.
story, but I'll say I talk about the public universal friend, for example, in the chapter on
Yes,
long hair, and that's a great example.
it absolutely is a great example. Gabby McCoy, one of our current fellows here, has a question about oh, it goes with Will's question. Can you talk about Loretta Velasquez and the research you conducted on her use of disguise?
Yeah, Loretta was a woman who disguised herself as a man to fight for the Confederacy during the Civil War, and she wrote a memoir of her time in service. And what I found so striking about her story was that she describes at length how hair transformation was fundamental for her to pass as a man. Now, it's possible that in reality, especially one of my colleagues, Rebecca Plant, has written about boys who fought in the Civil War, so there were who pretended to be older than they were essentially, and so it's possible that some women could, even without facial hair, pass as a man, pass as a teenage boy essentially, and fight in the Civil War. But Loretta writes with such conviction about how important her facial hair disguise was and her hair. She cut her hair short, but she writes an entire section of the book is called "My Mustache in Danger," where she talks about how she had this fake mustache she glued to her upper lip, and one time she was drinking a glass of buttermilk and it almost like fell off into her glass of buttermilk. And she was so worried that that would be the tell that would reveal who she really was. But it didn't. She saved her mustache and it never fell off. What was so striking about her, and another example of martial cross-dressing I read for the Civil War, is that if we go back into the Revolutionary and War of 1812 eras and we read martial cross-dressing narratives like The Female Marine, for example, hair is not really that central to the disguise. Clothing is, but hair is not really a big part of it. And I saw how hair becomes so much more important as hair in general is becoming more important to conveying the gender of the person from whose body it's growing. So it seemed it was a reinforcement of this broader context where by the 1860s, hair is so important. And so many men are, by the Civil War, wearing some form of facial hair that to be extra convincing, Loretta donned a fake mustache.
Okay, Nell Painter is asking how salient was age as a hair category in the 19th century? And if you have time, how about the aesthetics of racialized hair?
Yeah. I didn't end up writing too much about age as a category, nor class, to be honest. I focused so much on race and gender and national identity, that is to say, who was an American or who was able to become an American and who wasn't. I'm trying to think about examples of age. I mean, gray hair certainly is a marker of old age, and there is a degree to which the manhood rights that facial hair increasingly accorded white men in the 1850s and onward, through the end of the century, were a form of manhood rights that contrasted white men from white women, from people of color, especially men of color, but also from boys. That the sort of fusing of facial hair, and specifically a beard, with the political citizenship that white men were really claiming, for themselves, certainly, was drawing a difference along gender, race, and age. So that's part of how age shows up, but it is not something that I focus on too much. Not Yeah, I think there was so much to say about race, gender, and national identity that I didn't end up talking too much about age. And then, gosh, racialized hair. I could probably talk for another 30 minutes about that. But I think what was really, to just put a cap on the Peter Brown story, is that I read a lot of in that same chapter about the way that hair texture was so significant in daily life and popular culture, in the way that people identified, especially African descent, that to have Afro-textured hair was popularly understood to be the form of bodily difference that could mark someone as African, as having African descent, even if every other part of their body suggested otherwise. That someone might have pale skin and blue eyes and blonde hair, but that they would have, a nose and a chin and all facial features that might suggest European descent. But that their hair texture, the kink in their hair, would reveal that they had Black ancestry. And what I think Peter Brown ultimately was doing with his cutting of the strand and putting it under a microscope was basically recapitulating texture in the same way popular wisdom was doing. Was I think, if you take, for example, if you take a green onion and you cut it perfectly perpendicularly, you'll get a circle. But if you cut it on a bias, on an angle, you'll get a kind of long, sort of fancy looking green onion. And I think basically that's exactly what he was doing. He was pulling straight these hair strands, but a coily piece of hair, even no matter how tightly you pull it, he probably was cutting it at slightly an angle. And that's probably the only thing that was reflected in his hair strand shape taxonomy. So, in a way, these folk beliefs, or these popular beliefs about hair texture and kinkiness being the element of Black ancestry that lasts longer than anything else, not only tells us something important about hair, but shows the way that these scientific efforts to legitimize white supremacy are really just recapitulating forms of popular wisdom.
Great, thanks. I'm going to squeeze in one last question.
Yeah.
I know we're at time, but David Kolgazer is wondering about um, in historic hair art creations. And I know you know about this because you started
Yeah.
your talk with some examples of hair, and I know that that's how you kind of got into that topic, I think, is looking at art objects and hair art and so forth. He's wondering if horse or other animal hair was introduced to add body or support to the end product.
That's a really good question. I think there was probably, so the emotional meaning of a piece of hair work, a hair objects, was that it was constructed from the hair of a loved one, whether that's a baby that has just been born, a person who's just died, a spouse, a close friend, a family member, or even a friend who's moved far away from you. It was a way to kind of bridge distance, whether it was genealogical or physical or emotional. So contingent on the meaning of the objects was that they were constructed from a known hair of a known individual. But I also found examples of there's one of the pamphlets at the AAS call by a man named Mark Campbell, a self-instructor in hair work, I think it's called, which is an instruction guide for making hair objects at home. He also says you can also tell me, which item in the catalog you want, and I can make it for you, which implies that he would be constructing it from hair unknown to you, the buyer of the object. And in those cases, it certainly seems possible that the inclusion of horsehair could have been slipped in there. But I do think the use of human hair as a medium of construction was really, I can't think of any specific examples I've seen where a human hair piece of hair work was included horsehair. Oh, there is not hair work, but some very inexpensive wigs, like for theatrical performances, would use horsehair in their construction. So that is one place. Of course, all the household objects that use horsehair as well. But in terms of hair art, I can't think of any examples off the top of my head. And certainly, if one had a piece of hair work, like a brooch or a necklace that was made with horsehair, it would be a form of deception in a way. Either you, as the buyer, were deceived, or you're communicating to the public that you are wearing the hair of a loved one, but in fact, it's a loved. Oh my gosh! I just thought of an example. There is a whole genre of post-Civil War hair work made by the Daughters of the Confederacy that is in Confederate museums, and they are made into like there's one that's a bouquet of flowers made from the hair of beloved Confederate generals, their wives, and their horses.
Oh,
So
well, there you
we do
go.
have, yes, so there you go. That's okay. That's one example of some Confederate horse tails. Horse hair
Wow.
is included in alongside their, their riders.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, Sarah Gold McBride, thank you so much. This has been really fun, and there's so much more in the book. I hope everyone will read the book. It's got so much in it, and you just gave us the sort of the tip of the iceberg of the many, many
Yeah.
stories in there. So thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us, and please join us for our next program, which is on September 4th. This is a hybrid program with the Kayla Reason, professor of history at the University of Georgia, who will be presenting on her book, Politics and Memory, Civil War Monuments in Gilded Age New York. So we hope you will join us for that. Note that this program tonight and many other programs listed on our website are all, the recordings will be there, and you can register in advance for all of our programs. They are all free and open to the public. So thank you all. Thank you again, Sarah, and have a good evening.